frank, it's not all about race, it's actually about class. And once liberation comes up, and of course it did in 1994, the issues then will be class. And I think that's probably what is happening in South Africa at the moment. There's a desperate need for a real middle class to arise. So you've got a very wealthy now, elite black population, but very small. And this huge number, the vast majority of people unemployed, living in very poor conditions still today. It's better than it was, but it's not there. My mum spent all her life in guiding. She was a girl guide and a trainer. And in the 70s, in the 80s, 1980s particularly, she was a national trainer in an area called the Ciskei, which is one of the homelands. I don't know if you know the history. One of the national government's apartheid's answers to the race question was to create little homelands, territories.
Bantustans.
Bantustans was the first word they used, yeah. And this was their home. So but of course, the people, there wasn't work there. And the people actually, many of them had been gone for generations by then. But people were sent back to these places in their droves. The migratory labour system, particularly on the mines, meant that there were very few working men, and many of the women left the homelands to go to the cities, to be with their husbands if they could be, but also to find work. So lots and lots of children, most children were brought up by grandparents. This was before AIDS kicked in, which was another whole problem. But that's a later issue. But my mum did a lot of work through schools, setting up basically youth groups for girls, and working and training black teachers to be guiders. And one of the tragedies that, a strange tragedy that's happened since independence, since the change in 1994, is that much of that sort of network has gone. It wasn't seen as important, and there were bigger issues, which I think that's quite sad. Peter Dirk Gys, any of you heard of him?
Yeah.
Peter Dirk Gys is an actor, still going strong, a satirist. Somehow he managed to make us laugh, black and white together. He would stand up on the stage and tell the most unbelievable stories, politically incorrect stories, and had the congregation, the audience, rolling with laughter. Yes. He took off Pick Botha, who was the Minister for Foreign Affairs at the time, I remember. He portrayed Pick Botha as Hamlet, black cape and these bright red tights. And it was to be or not to be, and he sort of flash his legs, which was pretty daring in South Africa. We didn't get television until 1976, by the way.
And he did The Housewife.
Yeah, he did also
Mrs. Breton.
Yes, he was a bit like
Bezuidenhout.
He was a Dame Edna type.
Yes.
South Africa's Dame Edna. But one very right-wing Afrikaans-speaking gentleman came up to Peter Dirk Gys and said, "You've really gone too far now. You should be locked up in jail. You can't say these things about the government. But I'll say this, bloody mooi bene, you've got really bloody nice legs." And he made us laugh. And I think it was the theatre, the arts and music that actually, in many ways, kept people going. Of course, we didn't have international people, sanctions bit hard. Equity, is it Equity, I think, is the British...
Actors Equity.
Actors, yeah. They wouldn't come. Even I remember watching the coronation, not the coronation, the wedding of Charles and Diana, and every time music sang, was it Westminster Abbey or St. Paul's? I can't remember.
Westminster.
Whichever. Anyway, whenever the cathedral choir sang, the picture was frozen, and we'd have a recording played because of the Equity band. The same music they were singing, but not by that choir. And the other person, also in the music world, was a man, Richard, who's still very active. Richard had a great gift for being able to bring people of different races and different musical talents. The Southern African tuning is quite different. It's pentatonic scale, quite different to Western music. But in about 1990, when Johannesburg was extremely tense, when there were daily attacks, people rampaging through commuter trains at stations, bombs and all sorts of things going on, Richard had thousands of people, black and white, singing the Messiah together in Zulu. And I can remember standing next to another man singing tenor, black man. I was reading from staff notation, he was reading tonic solfa. You probably don't know what that is. It's do, re, mi, fa, so. Sound of music? Do, re, mi, that's tonic solfa. So the missionaries who introduced music into South Africa, for some reason, didn't teach staff notation, which is the more conventional. They taught this do, re, mi, fa. Interestingly, our choir here at St. Peter's, the children still use what they call solfege, which is that particular style. It is very good for teaching sight singing and getting intervals between music. So this is a little bit of music history. I think I've probably said enough, actually.
Well, Frank, can I just perhaps ask a couple of questions before I open up to questions generally? You've mentioned some very interesting pictures of different people that form a tapestry of the country. But how did, from people you grew up with, went to school with and university with, how did you notice any change in views as the 80s came along from 76 to 1990? How did people change their views? Were they changing, or were some people just refusing to change?
Yeah, I think, there was it would be true to say there was a cross-section of views. Some people hardened. Remember when we talk elections, we're talking only white people elected. For years and years, Helen Suzman, who may be a name some of you remember, was the sort of leader, the shining light of the liberal side of politics, and was always the opposition. So you have the National Party here and then the opposition. I forget the dates, but around about 1980, a further right wing from the government party began to grow, called the Verkranters, and they became the official opposition about 1983 or something. And actually, there was quite a wave of whites who left the country then, the more liberal end of the whites. They just said there is no hope if the opposition has moved to the right of apartheid. It's just not going to happen. Other people, of course, were more determined than ever to pay the sacrifice and to make the changes. And, but it was definitely polarizing.
Yes, yes. So
sorry, for people like me, I'd never heard of Nelson Mandela. He was banned. So he went to prison in about 1963. I was 8. I wasn't aware at all. I began to hear of his name mentioned in 1976. So I was 21 or so by then. And we did not know what he looked like. Nobody had seen a photograph of him for 28 years. On the day that he was released in South Africa, it was a Sunday afternoon. I was in Johannesburg at the time doing an afternoon service, and I knew mostly black people who were there. I knew that they would want to be watching on television. Most of them didn't have access to TV, so we put a big television in the cathedral, right in the centre of the city, and we watched him walk out. And there were a couple of people who had known him, including one woman called Ethel, her claim to fame was that when he was a young student, he had boarded with her family, and her job as a young girl was to wash his socks. But her response when she saw him was to say, "How, but you have aged." We did not know what he looked like. So there's that blanket sort of ban.
Now, you were still in South Africa in 1990, as I say, those you worked with, your colleagues, those you've grown up with, how did they feel about the prospects for the country at that particular moment in time? What was your memory of that?
I think we thought it was going to go in smoke. We thought it would be it would just erupt into violence, and the violence was already horrible, horrific.
Yeah.
People still do behind locked doors, and burglar guards. I was there just in September last year, staying with my wife's family, and they built themselves a little compound, and there are other reasons now for thinking that the crime is horrific, but the politically motivated white people, I think on the whole, most white people would have thought there's not much hope.
As you've gone back then, over these different times, are you sensing any change of view from the sort of people you know that they...
Yeah. I mean, one of the wonderful things, you walk through a shopping mall now and you see young people, teenagers, all in school uniform. In Port Elizabeth last year, I remember seeing it, thinking, wow, this would just never have happened. There's a white kid, there's a so-called coloured kid, there's a black kid, and they're just doing what teenagers do. I mean, you know exactly what they do. They're all walking around, best of friends, like this.
Yeah.
So that's very normal. But the poverty is still there, the unemployment is still there. My first trip back was 1998, and what I noticed there was that all the townships had electric wires strung through them. So most of these black townships didn't, when I was there, didn't have electricity. Another thing I noticed in Zululand, which is Natal area, was that the very rural areas where cholera had been a huge, huge problem, every little hut had another hut, which a toilet, a particular system of toilet. I'm not quite sure how it works, but a sort of solar-powered toilet. It wasn't waterborne sewage, but and that's wiped out cholera. Just wiped it out.
There's actually been some fascinating things happened in the townships on that civil engineering side, and that's been, I think, some world-leading stuff that's happened, certainly since 1990 and so on. Now, I want to turn it over for any discussion generally. If you want to ask any questions or make some comments, yes?
It's sort of along the lines that was just asked.
We have a microphone here, if we could just share it, because I think we're recording. Thanks, Kitty.
Could you give some idea of the ratio of the whites who were supportive of apartheid and those that were against it? And how much did that sort of vary between the Boers and the English?
Well, I guess the first thing is, which I did refer to, is that never in all those decades of national government, formal apartheid, they never got to 50% of the white vote. There was a phrase that I seem to recall, sort of 40-60. About 40% of the white population were English speaking or of English origin, and I've already mentioned some of those English speaking would definitely have supported apartheid because it was in their interest to. The United Party was one of the big parties. In fact, it was Jan Smuts's party, which then became, after 1948, became the official opposition. And it was often said that white English-speaking liberals would talk progressive, that's Helen Suzman's party, talk progressive, vote United Party, and thank God for the nationalists. I remember Norm Saw, the woman I've mentioned who became a doctor eventually, saying to me, Frank, when we go to an Afrikaner's house, a Boer's home, we're sent round to the back door, we're given a cup of tea out of an enamel mug, and we have a conversation. The white person standing on the top step and I'm at the bottom step. When I go to an English-speaking person's home, I'm invited in the front door, taken into the lounge and served tea in a china cup. But I know when I've left, they will take that cup and use Vim to clean it, scour it, clean it. And so there was this, yeah, it's hard to know. I mean, I think it's hard for people to understand when you grow up in a system, you actually just take it for granted. I never met a black person as an equal, as a person to talk to, until I sat down with that guy, Victor. I was 21, and I was unusual. Most white people would never have that opportunity. And so when the initially the private schools, and then far fewer private schools, church-run schools in South Africa than there are in this country. When they began intentionally to bring black students, because they were white schools, but black students in, that was very radical. Suddenly, black and white kids began to meet together and actually realised that they're interested in the same things. Some years ago in New Zealand, we had a barbecue, and we invited people who were not born in New Zealand to come to it. There were about 20 people who came round. And interestingly, there were 3 lots of South Africans: white, black African, and coloured mixed race people. And what we suddenly discovered was that the jokes that we could tell, the in-house jokes that only people who've grown there, were all the same. Mm. And as in South Africa, we would never have realised that actually we had so much in common. And even now, when I talk to people, I talk about the memories and the smells and the food. You know, it's all in common. There was this very forced separation of people. Not only, and don't think in apartheid, don't think of black people as one group of people. They were just segregated tribally. One of the really iniquitous things that happened in Grahamstown, which is the sort of territory that Nelson Mandela comes from. He's a Xhosa speaker. So that whole area, Eastern Cape area, Xhosa speaking, they brought police, Zulu-speaking police. So they actually they didn't use local people to do the policing. So there was this black-on-black suspicion as well. I don't know whether that answers that.
And why did you decide to leave South Africa?
Why did we decide to leave? I guess, well, partly that sense of despair. Partly we had very young children. We realised that I didn't think we'd be able to afford to give our children the sort of education that we had benefited from. I couldn't really see a future for myself. I didn't feel that I would be able to work, I'll be very honest now, I didn't think I'd be able to work under a figurehead person simply who was put in, my boss simply because of their skin colour. It was an integrity for me. Yeah. Whether right or wrong, I don't know. It was very violent. I was working at the time in Johannesburg. We lived in the suburbs. In the last month that I was there, 3 people who came to see me in my office were mugged within 10 minutes of leaving the office. That sort of violence. Christine, when she brought the children, because she had children, that was one of the interesting things. Children were always seen as treated as sacrosanct. If you had children, you were pretty much safe. But she would take off her earrings, her necklace, her watch, wedding ring even. You know, she would walk into no handbag. Just
well, I know because
so the violence
my cousin in the Northern Transvaal, he said he knows 5 people who have been murdered. And when I was telling my other cousin in the Cape, she said, I know 3. Yeah, well, you don't normally...
And that's true of black and white people.
Yes.
Baragwanath Hospital is one of the biggest hospitals, not only in the country, but in the world, for spinal injuries. And you know why? Because the favourite instrument of weapon is a bicycle spoke, a sharpened bicycle spoke. So you're standing in a crowded commuter train, and this little, just turn on, the spike goes into your back, and you get the $5 that he's got in his wallet, and you've got a paraplegic. Anyway,
any other comments? Kitty?
Yes. So, could you describe a little bit about what happened in the process of after apartheid, of integration? I mean, because everything was separate. Not only where people lived, but hospitals, schools. I'm sure there were drinking fountains, as there were in the South and in the United States, where there was a drinking fountain for whites, there was a drinking fountain for blacks.
Post office had 2 entrances, one for whites, one for blacks. Park benches had that. Remember, I wasn't there through that, so I'm talking about what I've heard from other people. I mean, I guess overnight all that disappeared. A lot of it had broken down, particularly in the cities anyway. By the time of 1994, black people had simply moved in. into the cities and taken over blocks of flats, which caused its own problems because they couldn't afford to pay the rents that were